Ladies and gentlemen, so we have with us on our list of brilliant speakers, Mr. Jaideep Prabhu. He has joined our meet, and welcome, sir.
Hi, Parvez. Thank you so much. Really a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much, sir. How have you been doing, sir?
I'm very well. How are you?
Yeah, we have been doing good, just in the middle of another COVID wave, but things have been okay.
Where are you based, actually?
I'm from the eastern part of India. I'm from Assam, but right now I'm in the capital, Delhi, New Delhi. So
And
we are
what's the
conducting.
situation like in Delhi, the COVID situation?
We are still hearing sirens out here, but it is getting better with time.
Yeah.
So, okay, sir. We will move on with the webinar, and those who have joined newly, welcome to India's largest webinar on business and finance. Today we have thousands of students joining from each and every corner of India. And next on our list of speakers is Mr. Jaideep Prabhu. Ladies and gentlemen, Jaideep Prabhu is an associate editor of the Journal of Marketing, Customer Needs and Solutions, and BMJ Innovations. He is on the editorial board of the Journal of Product Innovation Management, the advisory board of Journal of Management Studies, and the Schmallenbach Business Review, and is a member of the senior advisory board of the European Journal of Marketing. He has consulted with or taught executives from ABN AMRO, BRAC, British Telecom, and Xerox, among various other organizations in Colombia, Finland, Germany, Netherlands, Portugal, Switzerland, UK, and the US. He has been interviewed by or has had his work profiled on BBC News 24, the New York Times, MIT Sloan Management Review, and several others. Prior to his current position, Mr. Jaideep Prabhu was Professor of Marketing and Director of Research at the Tanaka Business School, Imperial College London, University Lecturer and University Senior Lecturer in Marketing, Cambridge Judge Business School, at the time the Judge Institute of Management, University of Cambridge, Assistant Professor and Fellow at the Center for Economic Research, Tilburg University, the Netherlands, and Visiting Assistant Professor at the Anderson School of Management, UCLA. Today, Jaideep Prabhu sir will speak on jugaad and frugal innovation and the important opportunities for Indian companies and entrepreneurs. Jaideep Prabhu sir, we are extremely delighted to have you here today. We are excited to learn from a pinch of your mind through this webinar. Your session will be followed by a Q&A session of shortlisted questions of around 15 to 20 minutes. Sir, the mic is all yours.
Thank you again, Parvez. Really a pleasure to be with all of you. As Parvez said, I'd like to talk about my area of interest, which is jugaad and frugal innovation. So I have spent my career studying innovation. In the first part of my career, I studied innovation in large Western companies because the understanding was that's where innovation happens. And then maybe about 12 or so years ago, I got interested in innovation in emerging economies like India, where I grew up. And so I want to draw on some of that with you during the session. I'll speak for about maybe about 20 minutes or so. We'll see. Then we'll have some discussion, and then I can resume my slides and speak for another 20 minutes and see how it goes. So let me share my screen, and I hope you can see my slides, which I'm sharing now. Parvez, can you see my slides?
Yes, sir, they are visible.
Okay, excellent. So great. So I want to talk about jugaad and frugal innovation and the opportunities for Indian companies and managers, as well as for entrepreneurs. So as I was saying, maybe about 12 or so years ago, I became very interested in innovation in emerging economies like India, where I'd grown up. And when I went to India to study the innovators there, I found they were very different from their Western counterparts. And they were different in three ways. First, the mindset was very frugal. They were very good at doing more with less. Second, they were very flexible in their approach. So they may have a plan, but they were good at moving to another plan and yet another plan. And third, a lot of the solutions they came up with seemed designed to be inclusive, to bring people who are from outside the formal economy into the formal economy. So let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. By way of contrast, here is what we may regard as an innovation in an affluent society. This is a high-end fridge that will talk to you and you can talk back to via this tablet PC. And for that pleasure, you pay about $3,000. Now, this is a bit of a caricature, but often large Western companies will do innovation this way. They will have big budgets, big teams. They'll spend a lot on technology, sometimes for the sake of technology. Then they put it in their products to differentiate them. And because that process is expensive and the customers can pay, they charge for it. Now, you may see something like that in India, but you are equally likely to see something like this. So this high-end fridge is $3,000. This clay fridge, Mitti Cool, is less than $30. I'll tell you more about the innovator in a second, but he comes from a village in India, from Gujarat. He, is very frugal. He's very good with taking what he has in his village, like clay and his own skills, water, and all that can make this fridge. So very frugal, lot of flexible thinking, and his intention is to be inclusive, to have a fridge for people like himself from villages, which would be affordable and which could run without electricity. Here's another example. So this is an incubator. This is a beautiful machine from a company like GE, but it's about $25,000. And at that price, it is beyond the reach of most people in emerging markets, particularly those in rural areas. That clinics will not be able to afford these devices. Even if somebody donates it to them, they may not have technicians there to maintain it. They may not have access to regular electricity. In a situation like that, something like this is very powerful. So this incubator is $25,000. This baby warmer is less than $100. Now, of course, the baby warmer is not an incubator. It doesn't have an oxygen tent, for instance. But it's designed to address a large part of the problem that the incubator is solving, namely the problem of infant mortality. When infants are born 1 or 2 weeks prematurely, they cannot maintain their body temperature. Some cases they die, some cases they're very badly affected. This baby warmer will save them. And interestingly, especially for those of you who are students, this product was not developed by a large company. It was developed by 4 students who are at Stanford, taking a course called Design for Extreme Affordability, where the entire objective of the course was to come up with a working prototype of a product that is 1/100th the cost of the existing solution. The students could take any problem or any issue. They took this issue of infant mortality and they came up with this for their course. After they graduated from Stanford, they went on to commercialize this. They tested it with mothers and midwives in rural India. They got venture capital backing from Stanford. They tested it in the medical hospital. And then they were ready to commercialize it. And at that point, they hit a wall. They didn't have a sales force to take this to rural clinics and so on. But at that point, they were able to work with GE Healthcare, and GE Healthcare's sales force helped them to commercialize it in exchange for a non-exclusive licensing agreement. So my co-authors and I, when we started to talk to people like this in India, we often ask them, and we came across so many such innovators, and we would ask them, how they would describe this kind of frugal, flexible, and inclusive innovation. And very often they would use the word jugaad to describe it. So my co-authors and I wrote a book about this, which we call Jugaad Innovation, which we defined as the art of overcoming harsh constraints by improvising an effective solution. So it's not a perfect solution, but it's a good enough solution. And importantly, it's a solution that makes the best use of the limited resources available in that context. After we published this book, a lot of people from other parts of the world wrote to tell us, hey, we have something similar in our country. The Brazilians told us they had 2 words to describe the same phenomenon. And you see equivalents in not only other developing and emerging markets, but also in the West. And so in the second half of my talk, I will talk about frugal innovation in the West. Now, what did we do in this Jugaad book? We looked at lots of examples, and we tried to find some principles that underpin all these examples. And here are the 6 principles we identified. First, these innovators are very good at finding opportunity in their adverse circumstances. For them, necessity really is the mother of invention. Second, they are very good at doing more with less. So they will look around and see what resources they have, and they'll use the resources they have as substitutes for resources they don't have. Third, the thinking is very flexible. So the idea is to improvise. If they see a mountain and they cannot climb the mountain, they'll try and find a way around the mountain. The solutions are simple. This helps to economize, but it also ensures that the solutions are easy to adopt, adapt, and maintain. Fifth, they include marginal people not only as consumers but also part of the solution. I'll give you some examples in a minute. And finally, they're very passionate about what they're doing, and they have to be because what they're doing is really difficult. It requires perseverance over a long period of time. So here are some people we cover in our book, and I'll start with Mansukh Bhai. He's the person behind the Mitti Cool, the clay fridge. He comes from a village in Gujarat. He has a high school education. He comes from a family of potters. In 2001, some of you may know, remember, there was a very serious earthquake in Gujarat. A lot of people lost their household possessions, including the matkas in which they store water. And he says that one morning he opened the local newspaper and he saw a picture of somebody's matka that was broken, and the caption read, "Poor man's fridge broken." And that was a joke, but actually it gave him the idea to come up with this fridge, a poor man's fridge. And you see that in front of you, the design. He set up a factory in his village to make these. He trained local women to be the potters, and then he went on to sell this device and many others, including on the internet. So, in many ways, he embodies all those six principles of finding opportunity in adversity, using resources he had to do more with less, keeping the solution simple, doing a lot of improvisation, including marginal people like women from the village, not only as consumers, but also part of the solution. They could earn an additional income from working in his factory. And finally, you can see him on YouTube talking about all his inventions. You see how passionate he is. Here's a different sort of innovator we cover in the book. This is Dr. Mohan. He's a diabetes specialist from Chennai. Diabetes, as you may know, is a very serious problem in India. In Indian cities, people can go to clinics like his. They can even afford to pay for that treatment, and he has a very successful private practice. But in the villages outside Chennai, he knows there are people who don't know what diabetes is or whether they have it. Even if they know they have it, they don't know what to do about it. They will not go to the city for treatment. It's too far away, it's expensive. And his doctors and their families will not relocate to the village. So he has come up with this jugaad solution. He worked with the World Diabetes Foundation. They gave him this van and the equipment in the van. He worked with ISRO. They gave him the satellite dish. This van goes from village to village. It stops. People like this lady from the village will step into the van. She looks through the eyepiece. The image is broadcast via satellite to the doctor sitting in the city, who can see it on his screen instantaneously on his computer screen. He can make a diagnosis, which he then communicates via mobile phone to this person who's a local health volunteer. So Dr. Mohan identifies people like this from villages. They go to the city for some days of training. They come back and they perform this very important role as a local health volunteer. So you see a lot of these models in areas like healthcare. Here is a different sector. This is electric lighting, and this is the case of Selco, which stands for Solar Electric Lighting Company, set up by Harish Hande in Bangalore. So Harish sells solar lights to people in urban slums or in the rural countryside who otherwise would have to use kerosene for lighting and cooking. And he says that the first problem he faced was the affordability of these solar solutions for people he was trying to reach. He says the best lesson in life he learned was from a fruit cart vendor who told him that 300 rupees a month was too much for solar lights, but 10 rupees a day was not. And so he did some market research to understand this better. And he realized that people like the fruit cart vendor, she would wake up in the morning, she would take a loan from the local money lender. With the loan, she would buy fruit and vegetables, which she would sell during the day. With the money she made, she would repay the money lender in the evening. Then she would buy food for her family. And then if she had, say, 10 rupees left over, she would buy kerosene. So working backwards from that insight, he asked himself, how can I offer solar lighting solutions to people like that lady at 10 rupees a pop? So here is his business model. He identifies people like this from the local community. And you see, that's an important part of the solution of many of these innovations. He trains people like that to maintain the batteries, panels, and the lights. Then often these people do not have bank accounts either. So he worked with a bank to give them loans, which he guarantees for 6 months. With the loan, this person sets up shop like you see here. He buys the batteries, panels, and lights, and then he charges the batteries during the day. And in the evening, he rents them to people like the fruit cart vendor for 10 rupees. So she is much better off because she gets a much better solution for the same price. She can, if she has kind of work at home, she can work longer and make more money. Her kids can study, so she's better off. But so too is this guy, because after 6 months, he has a credit history and he's in the banking system and he has a business of his own. So we see lots of these kinds of examples from these kinds of startups, these social enterprises. They come up with very interesting solutions for their local communities, but often they struggle to scale. And this is where large organizations can come in because they have the means to scale, they have the resources to scale, including multinationals. So GE has its largest R&D center in the world in Bengaluru. Over 4,500 people, scientists and engineers working on all kinds of issues like medical devices and so on. Now, with medical devices, they realized that for a long time, what GE was doing in India was taking, say, ECG machines they had designed for Western hospitals, maybe taking away a few features, dropping the price a bit, and then selling them in Indian city hospitals. But a large part of the market is the rural market, where the rural clinics will not have their own doctors. The doctors will typically go from the city to the countryside on a day trip. So they said, okay, for that market, we would need an ECG machine that is very different from what we have. We would need not only a highly affordable one, but one that's portable, fits into a doctor's bag, runs on batteries, is very reliable, etc. So they knew it would need to look something like this. Then they went one step further and said, okay, instead of developing this machine like we would usually do in house and with a big budget and a big team taking time and owning all the intellectual property, why don't we copy our Chinese and Indian competitors and basically look for off the shelf components that we can quickly assemble, cut and paste to come up with a solution? So, working backwards from the specification, they said, what do we need? Okay, we need some kind of a printer. Okay, bus ticket printers, we can use those components. We can even use the paper they use because that's cheaper. We need keypads. Telephones have keypads. We can adapt those inputs. So they take these various inputs, they apply a quality control standard, and then they are able to develop this product faster, better, and cheaper. It was very successful in India, then they introduced it in China, and now they have FDA approval and they're selling in the West. For many years, Nokia dominated emerging markets like India by doing this kind of frugal innovation. So in the late 90s, they sent people to live in slums in Brazil, in Ghana, in India, like in Dharavi. And they noticed that even though mobile phones were expensive at that time, there were people in slums buying them. But because it was such an important possession, they would immediately cover it in plastic to protect the phone from dust. Then they noticed that people were using, because they often did not have electricity at night, they would use the weak light in the phone to see their way in the dark. So they took those insights back and they came up with this very affordable, robust phone that also had these key features: a dust-proof keypad and a built-in flashlight. And these things made this phone phenomenally successful. Until the iPod and iTunes came around, this phone was the world's best-selling consumer electronics device. Of course, now people around the world have access to mobile telephony, not just basic phones, they even have smartphones, even in remote areas. Now, once people, even in remote areas, have access to mobile phones, you can offer them other kinds of services on the phone. So, for instance, in Kenya in 2007, Vodafone introduced a service called M-Pesa, which allows a lady like this from a village in Kenya to use her basic phone to call her son, who may be working in the city earning an income, not only to speak to him, but to ask him to send money home in an emergency. And he could do that simply by texting it to her from his phone. She could receive that text message as e-float in her phone and then go and cash it in the local corner shop in the village, the local kirana shop, which would be an M-Pesa agent. So this created a system for micropayments for people who are outside the banking system, and also for money transfer for migrants. This was a huge killer application in a country like Kenya. Now there are more than 25 million people who have access to this. And this was done very frugally without creating any new assets, just using what was already there. People already had mobile phones, they were already used to texting each other. And of course, they had local kirana shops which could act as agents. Now, once you have someone like that empowered to make micropayments, even if they don't have bank accounts, you can sell other things to them, like these solar lighting solutions. So this is a solar lighting solution sold by a company called Mkopa in Kenya. And this does not, because of M-Pesa, they don't have the problem that Harish Hande encountered in India of 300 rupees a month is too much, 10 rupees a day is not, because you can set this up in somebody's hut in rural Kenya. They will not have a may not have a bank account. They may not have the liquidity to pay the upfront cost of this asset, but they will pay it off as if on a weekly basis with micropayments, as if they're paying for a utility, and they use M-Pesa to do that. So that helps the consumers to acquire this capital asset, but it also helps the company because they do not have to send people to the village on a weekly basis to collect the money. They can remotely monitor this. If people pay, then this system works. If they don't pay, then they can remotely disconnect it until a payment is made. So that was the book, Jugaad, that came out in 2012. It was mainly about emerging markets and what Western companies could learn from their counterparts in emerging economies. Now, before I turn to talking about the same phenomenon in the West, let me stop sharing and let me take any questions that you may have at this point, so that I get a feel for the audience. If there are any questions or comments at this point, let's take a few, and then we can return to the second half of my lecture.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Yes, we do have some questions and we have shortlisted a few. So, one of the questions that we've got is that how can we cultivate an atmosphere of frugal innovation in India's student community?
Okay, that's a brilliant question. Actually, my second half will really get at that. We'll show you some models of how it's done. And actually, I think students and young people are a major driver of this phenomenon. We see more and more students, particularly those who are in universities that have both a technical arm and a business school. We see a lot of entrepreneurship taking place. They have entrepreneurial clubs and societies. They have competitions on an annual basis. They can present their ideas in teams, cross disciplinary teams. They can win small amounts of money, which they can then use to bootstrap their idea. And this is not only in software, we see this in hardware. They then have access to spaces where they can tinker and come up with prototypes. If they need business advice, there are accelerators within the university, like our business school has an accelerator. They can enter that program, they can get mentoring and guidance, and then they can commercialize. They have access increasingly to all kinds of investors, angel investors, venture capitalists, and also banks. So we see increasingly an ecosystem with a lot of tools and resources available widely to young people, to students, and also a drive from young people and students to participate in this. And we see this happening around the world, including India. I will talk more about this in the second half of my presentation. But a great question.
Thank you, sir. So another question that we have just received is that did Nokia's focus on lower income consumers draw its limited resources away from the smartphone market?
Very good question. And actually, Nokia, despite its dominance in the mobile phone sector, they had something upwards of 50% market share in many countries like India for over a decade. They actually got squeezed at both the low end and the high end. There was a pincer movement, you may say, which actually resulted in them being stuck in the middle. And if you have studied Porter on competitive advantage, he says you should either be at the high end or in the mass market. You don't want to be stuck in the middle. And Nokia was that classic stuck in the middle. At the high end, they were knocked out by Apple mainly. who came in with superior designs and real, just a completely different paradigm in terms of no buttons on the phone. When Steve Jobs first showed that, I mean, people were just blown away. So Apple just took away the top end of the market from them, and the bottom end of the market was taken away by Chinese phones, including so-called Shanzai phones, which are basically below the radar. They are from the gray economy. So there are lots of Shanzai companies in Shenzhen in China, near, for instance, the Foxconn factory, which makes the Apple phones. When as soon as Apple sent their latest design to the Foxconn factory, that design would have leaked out to the Shanzai phone companies. They would, in before Apple could actually, Foxconn could produce the actual first iPhone, they would produce a copy of the iPhone customized for the Chinese market. Those phones then come to countries like India and other emerging markets, and they completely took away the bottom of the market from Nokia. Plus, there were companies like Samsung. So intense competition from the high end and from the low end, and they ate away Nokia's advantage, which was in the middle.
Well, thank you, sir. I think we have just one more relevant question in the comment section, and it is although frugal innovation or jugaad is a very attractive concept to have, are there what are the limitations, if any, and the challenges that come with this concept?
Great question. And of course, there are limitations. So, and many of you will know the connotations of jugaad, right? In India, it is associated in many people's minds with cutting corners, with shoddy work, or even illegal sort of loopholes. And yes, there is that downside. But there is also the ingenuity and the creativity that goes with it. That's why when we wrote our book, we called it jugaad innovation. So the idea is not just to have like a quick fix that maybe one farmer uses or one household uses, but to take that basic kernel of an idea, a creative idea, and try to actually scale it, to actually commercialize it, which is the innovation component. So let me go back to the M-Pesa example. Vodafone had this idea in 2007 or 2006 to take not take mobile phones, because people in slums in countries like Kenya, they knew were already using mobile phones. Even though those people were not banked, they were in the informal economy, they knew they were really buying mobile phones. And they then asked themselves, what kind of services can we provide them on a mobile phone? What about micropayments? Because these people have to make payments all the time and they operate in the cash economy. And so they went in with a pilot. They did a pilot in a slum, Kibera, in Nairobi. And they had this idea of actually using it for microfinance repayment of loans. But actually, the microfinance agents didn't want to use the mobile phone. They liked to go door to door to collect it because that's how they build trust. And so the Vodafone people will say, okay, what can we use the phone for in terms of payments? And then they noticed that people already in the slum had figured out a jugaad of basically texting each other spare minutes, mobile minutes, and using it as a form of currency. So they were making payments in their own jugaad way. And so Vodafone said, what if we can take that insight, that jugaad, and make it a systematic solution? So we can create a software platform that enables people to essentially text the equivalent of minutes to each other, which is a form of currency. We will back it up with an escrow account that has real money, and we will have agents in villages that can cash that e-float. So basically, they took that insight and then they created a system around it. So we need to have that kind of process innovation as well, and business model innovation on top of the ingenuity. So we can't just stick with jugaad, which is a quick fix. We have to move from jugaad to jugaad innovation, which is a kind of systematic use of that creativity and those ingenious solutions at a local level.
Thank you, sir. I don't think we have any more relevant questions at the moment, so I think we should continue.
Okay, so great. Thank you, Parvez. So let me now go back to my slides and let me pick up from where I left off. So prior to the this brief break, I was talking about Jugaad Innovation, the book which we wrote in 2012, all about emerging markets like India. So after that book came out, we saw there was a lot of interest in this idea of frugal innovation in the West, for the West. So we started to look at that, my co-author and I, and we realized that in the West, this phenomenon of frugal innovation was being driven by a group of consumers we decided to call prosumers, because they were not just passive recipients of products and services from companies, they were more actively involved in the socio-economic process. And they were driving at least three major movements that underpin a frugal economy. One is the sharing economy, where increasingly now people like you and me can directly trade spare assets with each other on a digital platform, for instance, like Airbnb. Second, this is a maker movement. This is where, as I was saying earlier, small teams of our students can actually do things, make things, and commercialize things that only large companies or the government could have done 10 or 20 years ago, and not just in software, but increasingly even in hardware. And finally, we have the circular economy. This is where people now realize that the old 20th century model, linear model, of taking raw materials and resources from nature, making goods and services that we then sell to people who use them and then dump them, that is no longer sustainable, and it's also highly wasteful. Instead, we need to move to a circular model where we reduce, reuse, and recycle all the resources that go into our products and services. So let me talk about these three movements. And I start with the sharing economy. Now, something like Airbnb, for instance, that kind of sharing economy sector was pretty small in 2013, but is expected to grow very dramatically by 2025. So how can something grow so fast? It can grow so fast because it is fundamentally frugal. It is asset light. Take this comment by the CEO of Airbnb, Brian Chesky. So he says, Airbnb competes with these physical hotel chains like Marriott. Now, Marriott may add, say, a capacity of 30,000 rooms globally in a single year. They would actually have to physically build that capacity. That takes time, resources, money, people. Airbnb can create that resource in 2 weeks. Why? Because they don't have to create anything new. They take what is already there. Just like M-Pesa took what was already there. People had phones, etc., and they joined the dots. This is what Airbnb does. It creates a platform that joins people who have spare assets in their homes to people who would like to rent them. So that's the essence of the sharing economy. It's frugal, enabled by digital. Now let me talk about the maker movement, and this is probably most relevant to the students and this question about a student ecosystem. So this is a small team of students from Northwestern University in Chicago. When they graduated, two of them had an engineering background, one had a design background, one had a business background. They set up an organization called Design for America. And their idea was, if you want to solve big problems in the world, you don't have to go to Africa or Asia. There are many such problems in the US. For instance, like this problem of hospital-acquired infections, which kills about 100,000 people every year in the US alone. So this is one of the students, Liz Kerber. They said, what can four of us do about this? So first they went to their local hospital in Chicago. They talked to the doctors and the nurses. They observed them. And they realized very quickly, these people really care about hygiene. But there are many moments in the day when they're too busy to go to the wall unit, to the basin with the wash water and soap and wash their hands, or even go to the wall to dispense the gel. So they went back to their studio, a small room which has basic computing equipment, software, and a 3D printer. And they said, they brainstormed. They said, what do children do when they want to clean their hands? Or they just wipe it on their clothes. Okay, so what if we can take the gel, which is on the wall, that unit, and have it clip onto the doctors and nurses' uniforms so they can just carry that gel with them and they can just dispense it whenever they need as they're walking. So they came up with that insight, and then in their studio, they developed a prototype you see here of this device called SwipeSense. So basically, you can run your hand on this roller, it dispenses the gel while you're walking, and you can clean your hands. And then every time you do that, it sends a signal. You see this, so it's a digitized product. It sends a signal to a wall unit that records the data. And at the end of the day, you can upload this data to your screen, your PC, and you can see how you have done relative to other people in the hospital. So these students came up with this prototype just using things that are now quite widely available. And then they said, okay, what next? How do we actually make this at scale? We don't have a factory. We cannot set up a factory. So they outsourced it to somebody to manufacture it for them. Then they said, hey, we don't have much capital, including to pay our own salaries. What do we do? So they set up a Kickstarter campaign, and they were able to crowdfund some money to support them. Then they realized, how are we going to actually distribute this product, get it to hospitals and clinics? We don't have a sales force. They just listed it on Amazon, and Amazon did the distribution for them. And then finally, they said, we don't have a big advertising budget. How do we promote this product? Well, there's social media. So they tweeted about it. One of them gave a TED talk, which went viral. The press got really interested, and they got a lot of free promotion. So all the things needed to identify a problem, come up with a solution, prototype it, manufacture it, market it, all these things could be done by 4 students using things that are available to many of us. Here's another example. This is one of our students, my students here in Cambridge. He was a mature student, so he was doing his executive MBA, part-time MBA with us in the business school while he was teaching in the computer science department here in Cambridge. And while he was teaching computer science, he was responsible for student admissions, and he and his colleagues had noticed that fewer and fewer young people were applying to Cambridge to study computer science. And the ones who studied had never opened a computer to really play with it, or had done any coding. So they said, this is a problem. What if we come up with a computer that's so basic, they will have to tinker with it, and they will have to do coding. And of course, it would be so cheap that if they break it, it wouldn't be a problem. So they came up with this Raspberry Pi, which is about $35, the first version. And they thought they would sell a few thousand units. They have sold many millions. Something like 7 million computers every year are sold by them. And they sell them not only to kids, but also to the adults who are using these devices along with other micro devices to come up with Internet of Things solutions. For instance, this student of mine, he takes the Raspberry Pi, he gives it a cladding, he's branded a co-learner, and he loads this with software called the Khan Academy. The Khan Academy is the entire US school curriculum available on YouTube in video form for free. Now, Prabhu said, well, there are lots of kids around the world who don't have access to the internet. They don't have access to PCs, but they usually have access to a TV in their school. So they can connect this to the TV, and then they have access to all this material and content. We carry around these very sophisticated networked computers in our pockets. This company called CellScope, which is spun out of the University of California at Berkeley, makes a suite of medical devices that plug into the audio jack of the phone and use its computing power and connectivity. So this is an otoscope, which a mother can use to take very high resolution pictures of the inner ear of her daughter when she has an infection and send it to a consultant who's somewhere else. This device is a fraction of the cost of the standalone medical device, and it enables telemedicine. And they have other such devices like dermoscopes for the skin and so on. 3D printers. This 3D printer is less than $200. So at that price, these devices are within striking distance of many households. But even if you cannot afford one at home, you can go to spaces. These spaces are called tech shops, make spaces, fab labs, etc. There you get access to a workshop full of all kinds of tools, not only traditional tools like lathes and so on, but also digital manufacturing tools like 3D printers, laser cutters, circuit board printers, all this kind of stuff. But importantly, you also get access to people like yourself, like-minded tinkerers that you can bounce your ideas off and get inspiration from. So those students I mentioned at Stanford, for their course, they had to come up with a working prototype. And they had this idea of a blanket that the mother could use to keep the baby warm. But that's not enough. You need something that will keep temperature fixed for a period of time. And they didn't know how to do it. So they went to the neighboring tech shop near Stanford. They went to the Palo Alto tech shop. And they started tinkering there and talking to people there, explaining to people what they were trying to do. And somebody there happened to be a former NASA scientist. And he told them about spacesuits having this phase change material, this waxy substance that you can put in a pad like this. and you can heat with either electricity or hot water, and this will keep temperature fixed for a period of time. So this is a key component in their device. Without this, it will not work. And they got that idea from the tech shop. So this is Jane Chen, one of those students with Barack Obama when he was president. Because when he was president, he actually championed this maker movement. He hosted a maker fair in the White House, and which celebrated and exhibited all these different solutions by people. And you can see why. His idea is that, okay, something that may be like a hobby today, do it yourself today, actually can offer possibilities for people to actually do a new kind of manufacturing down the road. They might be able to create micro factories in cities, which maybe don't make the whole car, but make components, spare parts of the car for local consumption. This can create high value added jobs. And of course, these factories will be much more sustainable as well. So the maker movement is very big these days. Cities compete with each other around the world to host these, and you have even children participate in them. And we have these in India as well. Now, I've told you a lot about startups driving this frugal innovation revolution, startups and students and so on. What about large companies? So large companies too have been asking themselves how they can tap into this frugal innovation revolution. So my co-author and I decided to write a follow-up book, which we call Frugal Innovation, which actually looks at how large Western companies are trying to innovate faster, better, and cheaper. And in this book, we did the same thing as the previous Jugaad book. We looked at lots of large companies across sectors to see what they were doing, and we tried to extract some principles from those studies. And here are the 6 principles. I'm not going to go through each one of them. I'll just highlight a few, particularly this one around sustainable solutions. So I mentioned to you how we are moving away from this kind of linear model of production and consumption to more circular model. This is a French company called Tarkett that makes flooring solutions for office buildings, like carpets and so on. They had this very ambitious plan to, in 10 years, completely transform the business from being a linear model to being a fully circular enterprise. So in 10 years, they were going to completely reduce, reuse, and recycle all the material in their products. Now, they realized this is not just a technical challenge. You have to do a lot of technological innovation, but it's also a behavioral and business model challenge, because you have to move from a situation of selling things in a transactional mode to your customers to offering a service in a contract. So now they have, let's say, 5-year contracts with offices to provide flooring in that time. The offices pay a fee, and this company maintains the physical asset. They still have control of the physical material. So they lay the carpeting, maybe in modular form. Then they know which parts are likely to wear out more quickly. They replace those and recycle it. Everything else is refurbished. So they're able to make the best use of this physical asset. I mentioned to you about tech shops, these spaces where you can go and tinker. Ford, the motor company in Detroit in the US, has partnered with a local tech shop. And its engineers, the Ford engineers, can go to the tech shop one afternoon every week just to tinker, just to play with people in the community, with others over there, with their own colleagues. And a year after they started doing this, they realized that it not only increased and improved the morale of their engineers, they were having more fun doing their work, but it also increased their productivity. They were generating more high value added patents from this activity. And a final principle of large companies making friends with startups. So Barclays, which is a big bank here in the UK, like many banks, they have realized they have lost their traditional relationship with the customer, which they had in the bank branch. Fewer and fewer customers go into bank branches, and they're closing down many of the bank branches. But they know that they have all this data which they collect on our behavior, our purchases, and they can analyze that data and then give us recommendations and guidance on how to use our finances. and that can be delivered to us on an app on a mobile phone, just like Amazon processes our purchasing behavior and then gives us recommendations. So they know that they can develop these apps in house. They have the expertise, they have the money, they have the people, but they're very slow as a big company. And they're very conservative, and it's a compliance mindset. So they would take a long time to do this, and it would probably be very expensive. But in London, there are lots of fintech startups that are able to innovate faster, better, cheaper. So Barclays partners with them. They have a space, they have a company that manages that space for them. That company identifies 10 promising global fintech startups that are housed there in that accelerator for 13 weeks. In that time, the startups are improving their idea, but they're also being mentored by people from the bank. This helps the startups to really understand how banking works, what the regulations are, what the customers are like. But it also helps the bank understand how startups work and what's possible with technology. At the end of the 13 weeks, these startups pitch to the Barclays team, and then the Barclays team makes a decision of whether to invest in it or to pass it on. So let me now just conclude. The journey that I've been on over the last 15 years or so, my co-authors and I, we started looking at countries like India in the 2000s, and that's when we wrote the Jugaad book. And that was really the focus, was emerging markets. Then we realized, hey, this stuff is happening in the West, and we wrote that follow-up book I told you about, which was about large Western companies trying to do frugal innovation. And we wrote the follow-up book, which came out in 2015. Then by 2019, we realized countries like India have moved on, and the global landscape has shifted to a situation where emerging markets like India are collaborating with the Western world to have a kind of global ecosystem of frugal innovation. So we decided to update our 2015 book specifically for India to see where India was in 2019. This book came out in 2019 with some new Indian cases. And we realized that India was building on its traditional strength in these three areas in the 21st century digital space. So, when I was growing up in India in the 80s, we did all of these things. I'm sure all of you also, growing up in India, had to do sharing. We shared toys, clothes, textbooks, comics, etc. with people. We were used to that. We did some making. We had, in many cases, make our own toys, make our own games, etc. And of course, India traditionally has very sophisticated communities who are good at making with metals, making things like jewelry, making statues, working with wood and clay, and so on. And of course, we were also very good at recycling, and hopefully still are. We would save things, bottles, reuse bottles, and so on. Now, all these traditional kind of practices can be transformed in the 21st century with digital manufacturing tools. And you can come up, so often students can do this. So here's an example of one such company set up by Shailaja Rangarajan in Bangalore. She had a career in the corporate world and then decided to set up her own company called Reimagine. And what she does is actually all these three things in the 21st century digital space. So first, she does recycling of waste materials, waste cloth, waste leather, waste rubber, tires, etc. She takes the waste, then she works with makers, women from rural areas who are experts at working with cloth and with leather and so on. And she gives them designs, and they produce these very beautiful things that people might buy in the home. And then those are sold on a platform, on a digital platform. Which is a bit like the model of Airbnb. We have a two-sided market. So all these pillars are enabled in a kind of 21st century digital context in a country like India. Here's another example of this. Is actually young people. They were, probably just graduated from university. They're in their 20s. A couple, Vaibhav and Richa, who set up a makerspace in Mumbai a few years ago. And in this makerspace, they were training students from around the world in how to do frugal innovation. Students would come from universities around the world to Mumbai for a few weeks in December, typically. They would go to Dharavi, they would look at the problems there, they would brainstorm, then they would go back to the makerspace and they would come up with prototype solutions for those issues. Now, when the first wave of COVID hit India, they had to immediately close these courses that they offer because people could not visit and move around. So they said, what do we do with our space and with our time? And just then, of course, there was a huge need for PPE, this personal protective equipment. So in the makerspace, they started to make these designs for visors, etc., and actually started to make these for local frontline workers. And then very quickly, they started to share these designs online, and they were able to create a network of over 40 makespaces in India that were sharing designs and collectively dealing with the supply chain problems and the shortage of PPE for their local markets. So you have a kind of distributed manufacturing. Then, when the second wave hit, with the Delta wave hit, and there was a shortage of oxygen concentrators, they did something similar. They created a movement of distributed manufacturing, over 100 labs in India that were open source manufacturing these oxygen concentrators using what was locally available, including expertise, to ensure that the hospitals had enough equipment to provide people with oxygen. So these are some of the possibilities led by young people in India using some of these tools and this approach to frugal innovation. So for those of you who are thinking about what does this mean for India, you know that India needs to increase its manufacturing sector. We have the Make in India program. What frugal innovation would suggest is that you have clarity now about what to make. You have to make frugal solutions, things that are highly affordable, that make the best use of available resources. Who do you make for? You make for the large number of people in India who are still left out of the formal economy trying to get in. Many of the people who live in urban slums or in smaller towns or in the countryside. This is a massive untapped market opportunity in India, especially for frugal solutions. If you can make good solutions for them, then those solutions can also go to richer people. And then finally, it's how to make. The making can be done not in the old way of having one big factory that may not be sustainable, but having lots of micro factories that you connect in some kind of a network in distributed manufacturing. And so it requires fearless dreaming, but also ruthless implementation. And what are some of the challenges? If you work for a large companies, even in India, they have difficulty doing more with less. They're used to big budgets, doing innovation in big teams. They are very structured and have processes, so it's hard for them to move fast. And often they are a bit secretive about how they do innovation. So there are some things they can do to solve that. They can give their employees time and space to experiment, like we saw Ford doing with Tech Shop in the US, or they could engage with agile entrepreneurs like Barclays Bank is doing in London, or they can create a kind of jugaad mindset. They can go to places like India, like GE, and others are doing, like Nokia used to do. If you work for a small company, your own startup, for instance, you have the opposite problem. You don't have the luxury of resources, so you have to be frugal. You don't have big structures and processes, so you can be agile. But as I said, sometimes you may struggle to scale. You may not have the resources needed to really scale your idea. And at that point, you may need to partner with large organizations. For instance, like the Embrace Baby Warmer did with GE Healthcare. But then you need to know how to do that partnering. So let me conclude by saying that based on my work over the last 15 years or so, I really believe that the world needs this kind of frugal, flexible, and inclusive innovation. I think emerging markets like India can gain by engaging with developed economies and vice versa. And I think large and small organizations can work together to improve lives everywhere. I particularly think that young people and students can drive this process. And so I hope that you will be part of that movement too. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Your session was a true reflection of great intellect and experience and knowledge of relevance of the particular areas